T-minus 30 seconds. T-minus 20 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to Kush'S Korner on the Trap Talk Reptile Network, the coolest reptile network in the world. Got a good one tonight. We have the return once again of Mr. Alex Myers, and we will kind of be doing a little bit of a back and forth tonight, talking about our favorite tools of the trade in the reptile world. Something that's pretty easy to overlook, but truly using the right tools and equipment for your animals can definitely make or break your success. So we will get into that conversation here in a few minutes. But before that, as always, USARC. USARC is the organization that is fighting for our rights to keep our reptiles, to run our reptile businesses, and to pursue this way of life. Check out usarc.org for all of the relevant information about the organization. And if you are not already a member, please look into becoming a member of USARC. As a community, we have strength in numbers, so the more people that are behind the cause, the better. And tonight we are brought to you by Texas Chondros. Mark Hager, one of my personal favorite Texans, and one of the leaders in the designer green tree python community. A great breeder of some phenomenal snakes. So if you are in the market for the best green tree pythons in the market, check out Mark Hager of Texas Chondros. He also runs the Texas Chondros Instagram page, which highlights green tree pythons from not only his collection, but from green tree python keepers all over the great state of Texas. TexasChondros.com or TXChondros on Instagram to check out what Mark has going on. And we are also brought to you tonight by SUNDOWN Reptiles. Brian Susan, one of the leaders in the reptile industry at the moment, particularly specializing in tree monitors, rare geckos, abronia, green tree pythons, and more. One of my personal favorite breeders, somebody who I think exemplifies what it means to be a professional in the industry these days, with some of the absolute best animals in the business. If any of those species that I listed off are of interest to you, I would definitely recommend checking out Brian Susan of SUNDOWN Reptiles. And last but certainly not least, we are brought to you by the Reptile Super Show. So the next Reptile Super Show, which is in Pomona, California, is coming up in January, the weekend of the 11th and the 12th. It is one of, if not my favorite reptile shows in the entire country. I will definitely be there. We'll be vending. So if you are at the show, stop by, say hi. But if you are in California, the surrounding area, you really have no excuse to miss this show. And if you are anywhere else in the USA or even the world and are looking to travel for a reptile show, there may not be one I could recommend more than the Reptile Super Show in Pomona, California. Always a great variety of species from hundreds of different vendors, and really some of my absolute favorite people in the industry come by for the weekend. So again, Reptile Super Show, Pomona, California, January 11th and 12th. Check it out. And here we are. Thank you, everybody who is tuned in live. Also, thank you to everybody who is watching or listening after the fact, either here on YouTube or on the audio platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcast. If you are here on YouTube, please subscribe to the channel. There's a new podcast every single night of the week from some of the absolute best hosts in the industries, covering a wide array of different reptile-related topics. So here on the Trap Talk Reptile Network, there's never a shortage of the absolute best reptile content that you could ask for. If you are an audio-only type of person, please give us a subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Buzzsprout, wherever you get your podcasts from. A 5-star review would be absolutely wonderful as well. With all of that good stuff said, let me bring in Alex and let's get into this conversation. How's it going, man?
Hey, happy Wednesday. Doing good. Really excited for this episode. Thanks for reaching out to me to have me on for this. I think I've got a lot to share, and I'm very excited about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, when you presented me this kind of idea for a show, I really enjoyed it. I like the premise of it. I'm like, this would be a good show. I've only ever heard one podcast kind of similar to this before. It was an NPR from probably 7 or 8 years ago, where they went over a lot, some similar stuff. But if anyone knows, it's you. In 7 or 8 years, a lot can change in regards to the technology and the equipment that we have access to as reptile keepers.
Oh, definitely. I mean, that's something that I personally get really excited about, reptile products and stuff. I just think it's cool to see the way the industry has evolved. I definitely have my fair share of, I guess, antiques, if you will. I've got old thermostats that just sit in my storage. I've got a bunch of neodeshes that I actually have modified for lizard hatchling cages. Okay. So it's just kind of cool to sort of, I guess you could say, combine the old with the new. Yeah. Obviously, what they came out back in the day works, what they had works, sure. But people are constantly refining, tweaking to make products safer, simpler to set up. And honestly, I know a lot of days people talk about automation with misting systems, and now I want to say there's like the UV lights that can actually dim up and down, be it LEDs, or I think Arcadia is doing it now with the T5 fluorescence, where you can literally mimic a sunrise sunset. It's pretty incredible. And to think that some of those concepts I just highlighted were not even available to the average consumer to purchase 2 to 5 years ago is pretty incredible. And yeah, I'm just sort of excited to share sort of my opinions, my experiences, as well as hearing your opinions and your experiences as far as out of all the products out there, what we consider important, what we think help refines works for us as keepers, as well as reptile breeding, and then the products that can possibly help out some of the listeners too.
Yeah, I think, one thing you said that is, a good thing to really kind of take a second to reflect on a bit is, the old versus the new. And I feel like a lot of younger keepers, especially some of the more inexperienced keepers, are much quicker to dismiss older practices, older mindsets, or whatever it may be. Truly, some of our best products we have available to us have not changed in decades, and it should stay that way. And we'll get into this in individual details, but there's some things that do not need to be fixed, but then other things, like we just said with the dimmable UV, there are advancements that are absolutely something that we should be taking into consideration. So I think it's cool to kind of juxtapose that and see what's old that's still good, and what's new that we didn't have access to that we should really be taking into consideration.
Well, most definitely. I mean, like I said, I still have some products that are discontinued that I'm still using to this day, just because it's worked for me. It's reliable. I've fixed it up because I can still access some of the parts at a hardware store and just fix it up. And, I've got some thermostats that I've had, since I was like 14, that have hatched eggs continuously, or even if they're not, say I've swapped out that old thermostat, it was on and off, for a herpstat, I have the on and off set higher than what the herpstat set to. So if my incubator for whatever reason failed, that on off stat just shuts the herpstat off. Yeah. So it's just cool things like that. Like I said, for me, it's a little bit more of a sentimental value for the sake of having that old product running, but at the same time, it works. It's a safety feature. And that's something else I figured I'd want to highlight as we start breaking in the conversation, is how can you use what you have. There's a lot of talk sometimes, like you were saying, about advancing, and people are trying to throw away the old school stuff. And personally, and I mean, I'm guilty of this, I have felt pressure that I have to just get rid of everything. Like, it's older, it's inefficient, or some people just say it's downright wrong to use on your animals. And then you find some keeper who's still using that technology today. He's like, I haven't changed it because the animals are just as healthy as the animals people are keeping with the newer technology. And the reality is I think part of that, something we've discussed in the past, is you just have to find what works for you. And sometimes, again, there's nothing wrong with advancing, but when it comes to the products that are available today, the products that were available yesterday still work and often can fit the same niche or role that you want to use it for in today's keeping as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, before we dive into it, Any cool updates on the animal side of things? How's your collection doing these days?
Not too much going on. I want to say last time you had me on, I finished moving everything up here.
Okay.
All the sail fins are up here. All the water dragons are up with me. And honestly, today was like our first snowstorm up here in Minnesota. So everybody's been pretty much starting to go into their dry season, if you will. Nighttime temps are getting colder in the reptile room. I did get a clutch of sailfin eggs, oddly, on Halloween, but I think this was just the female cycling for whatever reason. I have no idea why, because this was 172 days from her last clutch, and her previous clutches she was laying 46 days apart. So she's laid 4 clutches, all infertile this year. I threw these 2 in the incubator because she was technically with a male for 5 days, but whether or not he was able to breed her, and she would have been like the eggs ideally would have still been in their, I guess, ova state in her ovaries, because if they entered her oviducts and she calcified them, then there's no way that sperm would have been able to fertilize it. However, I peeked on them yesterday and they're not bad yet. So it's been like 20-something day, 21 days since Halloween. So we'll see what happens. I've got low hopes. I've had so many eggs go 2 months and then they just die. And I think that's just because Hydrosaurus eggs are super calcified. So maybe the mold or the bacteria just takes a while for it to go bad. I also fully bury the eggs. That's what my mentor, Scott Corning, was telling me, how he sets up his Hydrosaurus eggs. And so I've got little bits of, springtails and stuff in the vermiculite dirt mix that probably eat the mold around the eggs. Yeah. So again, I don't mind, because I've seen some really gross looking eggs hatch from water dragons I've bred in the past. So we'll see what happens. This is sort of the exciting part, is I'm updating my personal sailfin journal now that I can say I finally have. And, this is year 1 of Hydrosaurus egg laying for me. So hopefully in the next 5 years, I'll start seeing a pattern, with this year being that groundbreaking year. So no confirmed success yet. In my honest opinion, if the Hydrosaurus are anything like the water dragons, once we get about like a month or 2 from spring, that's when they'll start breeding. So eggs start getting laid and ideally hatching in the middle of the summer.
Okay.
We'll see.
Cool. That'll be awesome. What species are the eggs from?
Pustellatus, Philippines.
Nice. Hell yeah. Well, that's awesome. Yeah, definitely. We definitely have a couple more episodes in store when it comes to once actually, babies hit the ground and everything, and, excited to kind of recap all of that.
I hope so, man. To work with them has been a dream. And so to now potentially be reproducing them and trying to really get them established, if you will. I don't think I've got a big enough group yet to where I could say they will be established for a long time, but with the bloodlines that I'm working with, as I want to say I highlighted in the episode with Casey Schultz, it's just going to be a lot of holdbacks, a lot of working with Casey, honestly. And ideally, if I can slowly but surely build up the right group of adults, I mean, having say 8.12 Philippines would be a dream goal, just to keep them around forever. I mean, I've traced all my bloodlines, as I've said numerous times, to wild caught animals, and just want to make sure they're here to stay,
Yeah. Hell yeah. Well, I feel like we probably will weave back and forth between sailfins and water dragons throughout our conversation. But with that said, what is the first topic within our tools of the trade you'd like to hit on?
I figured maybe banter back and forth about thermostats, preferences. How do you use your thermostats? What brand of thermostats do you use? Have you noticed a difference between the brands you've used? I say, if you want, kick it off. How do you use it for, like, say, your snake setups? I know you've got some heat panels in the setups behind you, I can see, but are you still running ambient? I mean, depending on the time of year, do you sort of do a hybrid setup?
It's dependent. Yeah, it's dependent on the time of year. Right now, as I'm kind of cooling everybody off, most everything is on ambient right now. Because the days are still fairly warm here. Like last night, when I woke up in the morning, it was 33 degrees. So that was pretty frigid. But like it got to the mid 60s during the day. So, with the sun, especially if it's not super windy, we can, the house will get into the upper 70s at the peak of the day still, but then I want to allow that drop in night to occur and, try to get some of these guys cycling. Everything that's like in these cages behind me, they're older animals. Some of my racks, or the racks that are to the left of me, that get a little bit cooler, I'll keep some supplemental heat on them, just to, just in case those snakes want to go, seek out that spot. But with my cages, it's not a perfect system, but I really just have the probe secured to where they're just like on their basking platform underneath the panels. And, the immediate kind of flaw there is if the snake sits on top of the probe, then the probe is reading a temperature underneath the snake, and the snake is in between the probe and the and the panel. So, I've had ways in the past where I've secured them a little bit higher and whatnot, but these scrub pythons in particular, they're all over the place. So, it's kind of hard to rein that in. But with that said, though, I'm not particularly worried about them getting a hot basking spot. They're not dumb. They'll move around. But I do think that they're not going to cook themselves to the point of having issues like, maybe some other species that are not quite as, mobile or whatever might actually end up doing. But anyway, so on the topic of the actual thermostats, I use, with the exception of one VE, entirely herp stats. I've used a good amount of thermostats. I definitely haven't used all. I've never used any Helix thermostats. People who I know who have used them really do like them, but Helixes are discontinued as far as I know, at least. So yeah, and then mostly 4s and 6s. So that's most of what I have. For the racks, as far as probe placement goes, I just have the probes taped directly to the heat tape or the heat panels, like on the metal racks, and then I just adjust the temperature appropriately. So if I want that spot in the rack to be 86, it might be 92 or 93 on the actual panel.
Nice.
Yeah.
Stuff. Are you so like for the metal racks, what setup are you running the thermostat on? Are you doing dimming? Are you doing pulse proportional?
So I've only ever used dimming. We've talked about the pulse, and this is a good opportunity for you to explain it, because I'm not even really sure what the hell's going on with the pulse. But yeah, I've always just used the dimming setting, and it's worked just fine for me. I've never really had an issue with maintaining a temperature with that setting.
Nice. Yeah, I was curious on that, because from what I know, again, I should clarify, for pretty much the entirety of my collection, I've got herp stats running on everything. Ironically, the only thing that I'm using the herp stat for as a thermostat right now is just my incubator. My snakes are kept at ambient, just because North American colubrids, and then all my other spare herp stats, which are pretty much a mix of 1 and 2s, I'm actually using the lighting feature, which I think probably 10% of people who buy herp stats actually use them for that feature. But it's kind of cool because I have them hooked up to all my incandescent heating lamps for the lizards. And so the timer unit in the herp stat, I have it set to ramp those lights for 30 minutes. So instead of all the incandescents turning on and then the UV lights turning on, now what's happening is the lights slowly dim up. And I'd like to think that's keeping the bulbs alive longer. The filament isn't just getting exploded with electricity. And at the same time, I'd like to think that might be healthier, or I guess easier, for the surge protector to deal with that slow addition of power, as opposed to all on, all off with, say, just an on-off timer inside the surge protector that's plugged into the wall. And then I guess, that's really the only main reason why I'm using herp stats. But for the most part, on my incubator, I'm running my herp stat on pulse. And then for any of the listeners, while I primarily keep lizards, and that's what I've talked about on past podcast episodes, if I haven't said it already, I curate a large reptile breeding operation for my full-time job. So I have, I want to say, the facility like 25 different of the professional ARS 55, 50 series racks. And then we have 10 of the 97 series tubs, which are those big 5 foot by 2.5 foot. And so we run herp stats on all of those at that facility. And that's what I was going to ask you, why you were running your metal rack on dimming, is because from what I understand, and again, it depends on who you talk to, with the metal racking systems, each layer of heat tape with the heat panels, it's just heat tape in the heat panels. And so since each level is then plugged into a power strip, the way that power is diverted, in theory, might be supposedly risky with dimming. I mean, you've been running dimming for years, so it could just be depending on what herpstat's suggesting. I just know in their instruction manual they suggest with large metal racking systems you want to run it on pulse, and from what I understand, it's just keeping the flow of electricity more regulated. Whereas in a sense with a dimming thermostat, for say, the power is constantly being applied. So on a herpstat, for those listening, if you're familiar with the herpstat products by Spider Robotics, there is what you have your current temperature at on the left side of the screen for the most part. Say it's a herpstat 1. And then on the bottom is what you would set it to, say 90 degrees. And then on the far right will be a little percentage. And so what that percentage is the amount of power being applied to your heat source. Yeah. And so in the case of a pulse proportional stat, the percentage of power implies how often the thermostat is releasing, in a sense, pulses of electricity. But on a dimming thermostat, it just means that the amount of electricity being released is just sort of a constant, in a sense, dimmed. It's like if you attach a dimmer to a light, you can see the filament of the bulb get brighter as you approach 100. And so I don't know the exact safety, and I guess I should, clarify like the exact electrical terminology as far as what a dimming thermostat does on a metal racking system if you're just plugging each layer into that surge protector and then the surge protector into the thermostat AC output. But from what I understand, again, that's just why I run everything on pulse. I do find it interesting though that you said you just smack the probe right like on the metal part. Yeah. Okay, so I do a really weird method where we get the insulated heat tape, or I guess heat panels. I pull back that insulation and I slide the probe in there and I attach it directly to the heat tape. Okay. So what I have found is if I check my highs and lows on those herpstats, I have hardly any fluctuation in temperature. And so what I believe is happening there is that since the probe is directly on the physical heat tape, so not on the metal part, and then it's insulated, it's not being exposed to outside air fluctuations, whereas if you attach the probe on there. And so that there could be pros and cons to this. The pros that I see to it is that your pulse proportional stat in this case is going to maintain a really steady temperature. Yeah. Heat tape is going to stay, I usually set everything to 96. Which everybody listening right now might be thinking that sounds really high for, we primarily breed North American colubrids and dipsodid snakes. So the reason why it has to be set that high is since that is the physical temperature of the heat tape, the temperature inside the tub might be 89, 92, because you have to account for that heat loss as the heat rises and dissipates between the heat panel and the tub. The other thing that I wanted to make note of in that case, though, is that because of how the probe is insulated by the heat tape, if your ambient room temps drop at night, which, face it, that just naturally happens in most cases, the heat tape is still going to be 96. So what I have found is if I temp gun at night, those tubs might have dropped 4 degrees like the ambient temp. So that's just something to consider. But as far as, again, in the case of rack system, that's sort of where I personally choose to use pulse, just because the manufacturer's recommendations say that amount of, the plugins, and then the fact that that surge protector is what's plugged into the herpstat. That's why I typically run the units on pulse. But I should clarify, for anything I want to say we have a couple Vivarium Electronics back heat racks, and at previous jobs that I've worked at, we've had a lot of sea serpents racks. You know, if you go to say the Tinley Park show, and I'd imagine if Sea Serpents is vending at a show in Florida where they're based at, they've got that standard 10 high V70 rack.
Yeah,
that's all one consecutive piece of heat tape.
right.
So since the heat tape is the piece that's plugged directly into the thermostat, that's where I would see dimming being a more suitable option if you're using a herpstat, because per herpstat's manual, to my knowledge, they just say dimming is their most effective method of temperature control. So it's just one of those where, again, you sort of have to follow the manufacturer's suggestions. I know Sea Serpents does sell a lot of their products with VE stats. Their incubators come with the VE stats. Yep. So VE, to my knowledge, on their instruction manual, they say just run everything on pulse with their stat. The VE 200 through 300 models and 300 times 2 or whatever, the one that's got the 2 outputs, it's like their version of a herpstat too. Sure. They suggest, those have dimming, but to my knowledge, VE is definitely more of a pulse proportional thermostat focused company. Like you said, though, it's just at the end of the day, sort of use what works for you as long as it's getting the temperature suggested. Hopefully with some of the information I just shared, it maybe gives you some more insight of what might be a safer option to run your racks at. But as far as probe placement, aside from directly on the heat panel, have you ever done any, I guess, different styles of probe placement? And if we're on the topic of racking systems, like back heat versus belly heat, like I know you used to have some Sea Serpent racks when you were in Chicago. Did you do anything differently with those racks compared to what you're doing with like your metal style racks? Or
yeah, I had one. I still have the rack. I don't run the heat anymore. A rack that I built that had back heat on it, and I really just secured the probe between the back heat and the tub, and then just kind of mess with the settings until I had it right. With back heat, you're inevitably going to need to have that tape be warmer to achieve a similar outcome, because the heat isn't directly transferring up. It's kind of like you need it to radiate outward when primarily it's going to want to radiate up. But yeah, I mean, nothing too special with that. I've seen people secure probes in tubs and drill a hole in the tub or something, and I never liked that. It didn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. It seemed like a lot more could go wrong than could go right. And then pulling that tub in and out, pulling the probe, getting it caught in something, getting it caught under the tub, just to me never seemed like the thing to do. Just you're asking for more problems than you started out with.
That's definitely something I've had, unfortunately, some experience with, is that in the big ARS 97 tubs, some of our older ones were set up with the probe directly in the tub, which for the most part, when the rack is closed, that's not an issue. And again, we're keeping North American colubrids. So what we would do is we would take tape and just, sorry, my laptop, for some reason, the text messages are not muting, but we'd take a Gorilla tape just to seal off the probe entirely. So if the snake even, defecated near the probe, if it burrowed, that wouldn't affect the probe in any way. The problem that I actually had with that system, though, is if I had to do a bedding change. So now you're pulling the rack out, and that rack's open for, say, half an hour. Now that probe is not right above the heat panel. And so your thermostat starts racking up the power. And so next thing you know, you go to clean your next tub. You're like, why is the hot spot, 90 degrees when it was supposed to be, say, 85? And, it's a small change because you're cleaning. But as you can imagine, like you were saying, in a, geez, my phone is getting blown up for whatever reason.
Seems like it. You're a popular guy.
Yeah, no kidding. There we go. Turn off notifications. So if my laptop, because that's what I'm streaming on right now, notifies, then I've got a real problem. So the point is that with those tubs is where was I going with this? Is that if you've got the probe in the tub and say a snake spills its water, or, you know, again, if maybe it's not as well covered, you know, the snake sits on it, like you were saying, if the snake that's in the tub with the probe is cold, so he sits on that, but maybe all the snakes in the other tubs where there isn't a probe are sitting on the hot side, then the probe is going to read the temperature of the cold snake. So now all the other snakes sitting on the heat, they heat up. It's just like you said, there's too much room for complications, I guess, if that makes sense. Sorry if that was poorly worded. But the point is that typically, again, that's why I try to just wedge that thermostat probe right on the heat tape, even in those metal rack systems. Okay, this is starting to annoy me.
Peak professionalism on the Kush'S Korner.
Yeah, peak professionalism. There we go. Now it's muted. So what's it called? The point is that the thermostat probes, just if they're not directly on the heat source, you're risking too much error on behalf of the animal. In rack systems, as you were saying, you've had some probes in your setups where, you know, the snake can sit with the heat panel, and so I think maybe in that case, I do my heat panel setups a little bit differently in some of my display cages when I've used heat panels. But before I can go off on that tangent, I'd be curious, maybe, you know, people, when you're doing scrub pythons, do you use heat panels in your spoloides and whatnot too? Like maybe break down how do you run your thermostat probes in that? Are you setting the temperature slightly different to account for the snakes possibly sitting on the probe, and break that down?
So before that, though, I want to just say one last thing about the rack. This really applies to a lot of different things, but one thing that I like to do with securing the probes is, you know, not only to, you know, place it where I want it to, but then tape it up somewhere where the probe isn't, where like it releases the tension that could be put on that probe by the cord pulling down. Because the last thing you want to have happen is that probe falls out of place. That's your nightmare, is that probe falling out of place and, you know, hitting the floor or something like that. So like, let's say like behind the rack, I'll have the probe, I'll tape it really well, and then I'll pull the cord up some slack, tape it again, and then a little bit up and maybe to the side and tape it again, just to like minimize the tension that's actually on the probe, and then the, you know, the piece of the cord that's just, you know, right after the probe. And I've never had a probe fall, knock on wood, but that's, you know, I feel like that should be emphasized as very, very important, as to make sure that your probes are secured very well and cannot move. This is a good question. So I just use foil tape. And truly, you know, the only reason I wouldn't ever use like a glue gun is just that I might move that probe. I might take that rack into a room where I'm running only ambient. I change things too often to where, you know, I don't want to have to find myself in a position where I have to buy another thermostat probe or something like that. You know, I bet you could do that. And, you know, especially if you know, don't damage the heat tape in the process or whatnot. And that's definitely not moving, but that's just never something that I've always found that the foil tape just really does the job very well with this. And then I guess a follow-up I mean, I have the probe touch the heat tape. I've always taped it on to where I've never fully encapsulated the probe in tape, for whatever reason. And I guess, you know, like Alex, kind of based on what you were saying about having that probe kind of being nestled within the insulation, I guess that could, you know, you could kind of draw some sort of a similarity of if you were to fully encapsulate that probe with tape or not. I just have always, for whatever reason, left part of the, like I would tape down the probe prior to, and then like a little bit of piece of tape on the absolute end of the probe, leaving like the middle exposed. What are your thoughts, Sir Alex?
So I guess he was saying, yeah, I should say shout out to Lucid Arboreals in the chat asking regarding if the probe should touch the heat tape or be catching the air oozing the heat. In regards to some of the heat panel stuff, I'll sort of explain a method that I learned regarding the probe reading the air temperature. But pretty much from what you were saying about the probe placement, yeah, that's pretty much spot on. If I'm not nestling that probe to be directly in contact with the heat tape on metal rack systems, I do the same thing with, like I said, when I've set up sea serpents racks in the past, or honestly any rack where it's a piece of heat tape running through the rack. You're not, that way then that physical heat tape is being plugged into the thermostat, and you're not taking the heat tape, plugging into a surge protector like you do on some of the more professional racking systems, and then you're plugging said surge protector into the thermostat. The probe is placed smack dab on the heat tape. Sometimes I do just take a whole piece of foil tape and I completely cover the probe. But that was just because in the event if there was like a draft or something, if I had like say the front of the probe covered and the back covered and that little metal area is exposed, technically with how sensitive the Herpstat probes are, and specifically with Herpstats, I want to say the internal computer on Herpstat can measure the temperature down to like 1/100th of a degree. So while we get the readout in tenths of degrees, I think it's even more sensitive. I'd have to double check that. But so as you can imagine, if say you have your reptile room door open and your house is set to 68, your reptile room 72, and that little bit of the probe is exposed and cold air starts to fill the reptile room, even though for the most part it is reading the heat tape on your rack, maybe it is maintaining that stable temperature of 90 degrees, and for whatever reason that draft drops it to 85, so then your heat cranks up on the rack, and then as soon as you shut the door, you get a little bit of a fluctuation. The other reality is at the end of the day, these animals are living in the wild where temp fluctuations happen. So it's probably not the end of the world. Like you were saying, you've never had issues with that. I'm sometimes maybe just more picky, and I like seeing, Herpstats running at a constant stream, but pretty much, at least in regards to heat tape and PVC racks or the heat tape within the panels of professional rack systems, slap that probe right on the heat tape.
Yeah. So just a follow-up. So with the whole like glue gun idea, I don't really think I have an answer for this, but Alex, you might. Do you see that like if you were to glue a probe into place, it holding up over time, given that it's directly in contact with heat?
In my experience, I haven't had any issues with that. I know, I'm trying to think. The best example I can think of is that in 2019, this is while I was going through college. I'd come home and I'd work at the same local exotic pet shop over the summer. Mm-hmm. And my employer at the time, he invested in a ARS 7030 unit, nice professional racking system. That way we could have the snakes just in a nicer rack for breeding. We were breeding ball pythons there. And I set up the thermostat on that rack that year. Okay. And I don't think that heat tape has been changed. The biggest thing with the foil tape is it's good and sticky. So, but I mean, they use it for like electrical work, so they want it to stay naturally. But what I would do is I'd just take a damp paper towel, I'd wipe off the heat panel in those racks and then just bam, smack the probe on there in that case. So they're still holding up. To my knowledge, they're still working. If the heat tape's been replaced, if not the heat tape, if the foil tape has been replaced, it's probably because maybe they're adding multiple probes to the rack. And I just maybe before we transition to cages, out of curiosity, how many rack shelves do you personally go for per probe? Does that like, for example, do you run a Herpstat 2? So you have 2 outputs on a 10 tub high rack? Do you do it on a 8 tub high rack?
Yeah, the only 2 racks that I actually have supplemental heat running on right now that are like traditional racks, they're both 8 levels high, and I just have 1 probe running both of those racks, and it's done just fine. But like naturally, the tubs at the top will be warmer, tubs at the bottom will be cooler, and I have animals placed kind of accordingly. Where I have some colubrids near the bottom, pythons near the top. So for that reason, it ends up working out for me. But obviously, like that rack I was describing that I had built for myself, I had separate heat tape top and bottom to where I could control the 2 independently, and that definitely worked well. I ended up primarily using the bottom part as ambient, and the top part is with the heat. Another thing, though, before we get off the topic of racks, so I have these like custom Cambro tub racks I use for my rattlesnakes, and so they have both LED tape running through, kind of snaked through, kind of like the heat tape on a sea serpent's rack, and then also back heat flex watt. So the whole thing runs off of, there's right now I have 8 of these like individual 5 high racks that are run off of one Herbstat 4, and 2 outputs control the light, 2 outputs control the heat, but I run the heat the heat tape off of the lighting setting. So they all have screen tops, so I'm not particularly worried about heat kind of building up in there. And I also don't have the heat tape on for extended periods. Like the peak of the season, I might have 7 hours a day of heat. But I have it set at like 95% output on the heat tape. And it's worked pretty well for me so far. I just knew that my thought process was like the having probes control all of these would be a logistical nightmare, considering that they're all individual units with individual heat tape, but it's not like a rack where you can kind of compartmentalize, okay, this whole rack should be roughly the same, it's really in the same place. I don't want a probe that's over here controlling a rack that's 10 feet away from it in the room where the dynamics would be entirely different. So yeah, I used the lighting setting on it, the dimming lighting setting, and it has worked well for me for a couple of years now.
Nice.
So
I wonder, does you do like a night drop then? If you're doing the lighting setting to where like you're making the lights run for 12 hours, so it'll slowly ramp the heat tape up, and the rattlesnakes are sort of getting like a sunrise temperature rise.
Right, exactly. So yeah, so like once brumation's over, it's just 12 on, 12 off. I'll decrease the LED lighting during winter until it's completely off for a period of time. But yeah, it's always, let's say like in the summer, the lighting will turn on at 8, and then the ramp on I'll ramp them for half an hour. The ramp on the heat will start at 10, be full up by 10:30, and then the ramp down will start at like 5:30 or 5, and then half an hour later it'll be off, and then lights are off at 8. So yeah, so that's kind of what I do with those, to kind of, like you said, mimic that sunrise, gets warm, cools off, sunset kind of thing.
Nice. Awesome. And you've had litters already from snakes in that rack, right? Or
I had an unexpected litter from a female that I did not breed, that retained sperm for a couple of years. So that's pretty cool. But I don't have any adult females in those cages or those racks anymore. They're all in Exoterra or Zilla cages with mini halogens now. Just the nature of how those snakes bask, the female couldn't get warm enough with a back heat through a tub. And for people who don't know how the Cambro tubs are structured, they're kind of like very diagonal on the side. So like if the female's sitting, let's see if I can do this, right around here, the heat is like that. There's already a natural gap between the heat tape and the tub, just because of the shape of the Cambro tubs, to where you could probably temp gun some of these females that I have basking at noon at 115 degrees, but in a very concentrated spot by the nature of the mini halogen dome. And that's kind of how they bask in the wild, where they'll throw a coil out from where like the rock they're sitting under, and it'll hit that spot, and then they'll pull it back in a little while. So all that is to be said.
Yeah, cryptic basking, I believe, is the term for that. It's how a lot of sort of the more animals that are active at dawn and dusk, or I want to say there's another term, I think it's like clathermal, or it's what they used to describe animals that are just randomly active based on when it suits them. So in the case of some of those rattlesnakes, I'd imagine in the hottest months of the year they're more active at night, and during the fall and the spring they're active during those peak afternoon hours when it's perfect, and then they retreat from the intense UV and heat, and then they get cold at night. So that's pretty cool, though, especially to I guess that's a good sort of comparison of and a sort of a good segue from like a rack setup to, you know, supplemental heat in an enclosure. And one of definitely the main ways that a lot of keepers and breeders do provide heat, aside from, in your case, you're using mini halogens on the crotalids, is radiant heat panels for a wide variety of snakes. So, you know, with the cages behind you, and for those that are listening to this on audio, can you just describe what size heat panels do you try and shoot for with the cage sizes you're using? Why are you using that size? Why are, you know, what snakes are you using them for? I'd imagine any listener probably knows it's mostly scrub pythons, but you've got a lot of really cool stuff. So I'd imagine you've got some different scenarios that people would find interesting to learn from.
Yeah, so it's been quite a learning process with these heat panels. In hindsight, I think I probably would have gone with bulbs over panels. And I say that for a number of reasons. One, I know people who use bulbs who are statistically far more successful than I am. And I've had the least success with large panels, most success with smaller panels. And, you know, if you just take the surface area of a heat bulb and compare it to a 36-inch wide heat panel, you know, that's a dramatically different thing. And that kind of large radiating heat source is not really very natural. If you compare it to what a ray of sun through some branch, you know, through some foliage would be. My most successful scrub python clutches have come from females that had smaller panels, relatively speaking. So if you can see, like in this cage right here, you would know what wattage that is. I do not. I think that's like the smallest VE panel that they make.
That'd be like 15. Well, I want to say they do 15, 28, 36, and then it's like 42 something. We at the where I work, we do have like a dry goods online website, and so we carry all the VE models. But I could be totally off on those wattages, but that looks like, you know, they're sort of 12 by 12 panel, assuming those are
it's like 12 by like 8 or something like that. You know, and then so those are 4 by 2 by 2 cages. I have those in them, and then in some 5 and 6 foot cages, I have the one that are they're like essentially like what 16-inch square or something like that, like the 40 watt, 25 watt, or whatever that one may be. But yeah, definitely I'm on panels. The longer I've gone on using them. I've never used the Pro Products panels, frankly, because I've never been able to get them. But from what I hear, that the Pro Products heat panels are just like the absolute best heat panels.
That's what I've got.
And it's part of it. I either I think the coating or something, but part of the heat panels is actually a fire retardant. So, you know, you have an immediate fail safe to the, you know, the absolute worst case scenario with a product like that, and they last forever. These have all lasted, so I have no complaints about these, but you know, only ever heard good things about the Pro Products panels.
Yeah, it's I only have one setup. I had a second Pro Heat enclosure, but I did sell that to a friend of mine. But the one cage that I have is just a standard Animal Plastics T8 that's got a Pro. I think it's a pH 75, so it's a 75 watt heat panel. But the one, I guess I would say, drastic difference that I'm using that heat panel for is ambient heat control. So as I was saying earlier, I have mostly lizards. I have 3 pet corn snakes. Had them forever. Yeah. And so I've kept them with heat lamps. I've kept them with, you know, heat pads and heat tape. But just with the PVC cages, the Pro Heat panel was the easiest thing to get for this model. The other 2 are in slightly taller cages that I've got deep heat projectors, which is pretty much like the bulb equivalent of a heat panel. It's got like the heat coils in there, but it doesn't get as insanely hot as a ceramic heat emitter. But anyway, in the case of the Pro Products heat panel that I've got, the method that I learned, and this was advice that I actually got from Bob at Pro Products. I called him because you can't order those heat panels on their site. You actually have to call him and he tells you what size he suggests based on a bunch of different factors. So he was asking me what my ambient temperatures were in the room, so on and so on. And in a sense, what I do is, like I said, I'm keeping the snakes at ambient heat, but in the event, especially now that I'm approaching winter up here, I keep my thermostat probes dangling in the air on the cold side of the enclosure. And so what I do is I have my thermostat set to, I mean, I don't have thermostats on them right now. I'm looking to buy a Herbstat 4 just to run all the cages, and then I'll keep them running constant. But for now, the room's been getting warm enough, and I just didn't want to waste electricity with a thermostat plugged in. That's never going to be running. But the idea is I'll set the thermostat probe to say 77. And so now what that does is it will slowly turn on the heat panel to just radiate heat and make the air volume 77 degrees.
Okay.
So now the areas on the shelf might be 95. And I think you were saying this earlier, if your snake sits on the probe, it's going to get hotter. But the idea is that the snake will always have access to that area that's 77 degrees. And I do night drops on my snakes for the most part, at least when I have thermostats on them. Obviously, the room naturally drops at night. But that way, I almost feel like it randomizes when heat's available. And I do catch them basking. They're smart. You know, again, they're corn snakes, but they do sit up on their shelves when they detect that the heat panels are on. And kind of like in nature, if I just have a warm summer day, the heat panels never turn on.
Yeah.
They just sit at 78, maybe 82, and then it drops at night. And the heat panel might turn on briefly in the morning to get the cage up to 77. But then once the cage is at the desired ambient temp, the panel turns off.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been cool to observe their behavior. They sort of they change seasonally. I don't hibernate them because, again, they're just pet corn snakes. But it's interesting seeing how they bask more in the winter. And part of me almost wonders if that would mimic how, like, say, some of the corn snakes are in Florida, where they do experience cold, but then the sun comes out. And so they'll have those microclimates where they could bask in the 80s. Yeah. And so, you know, and during the winter, I'd imagine with this room, again, I moved up here this spring. But if it's anything like how it was in Illinois, you know, we've got the heat on in the house set to 66, whereas the AC in the summer is 76. So the summer, the heat panels are hardly on, but in the winter, these heat panels would be on more.
Right.
And so maybe now they're basking more, and then they detect that it's summer, so it's just warmer and they don't need to bask. It's just been a cool observation. And again, that's just the method that Pro Products suggested. So then you could apply that to, say, somebody with a ball python in a similarly sized cage with a heat panel that, you know, Bob would help you figure out. You set your probe to 81, right? Mm-hmm. Isn't that what most ball python people try to keep their rooms at? 79?
I don't know, 88 or some crazy shit. I'm not sure.
But the point is like then your heat panel will just turn on and off to keep the ambient in that cage 81, and now your ball python will, again, if it's a pet, obviously if it's a breeding snake, you want to provide that constant belly heat so the female can find that hot spot to lay. But it's just another the Pro Products method, I guess you could call it that.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and I've had really good success with it. And again, with the Pro heat panels, I am yet to have an issue with them. Part of it is because I think, you know, they technically really only run in the winter for me, because in the summer everything's just staying at ambient heat. But yeah, I want to say, I mean, I think that's what Rob was primarily using at the Discovery Center when we were working there. So
yeah,
they work. They're great panels. They're definitely a little bit more pricey than the VE ones, but you know, I've heard of people having those things running for 20 years.
Yeah.
I remember Bob was telling me something where before they send out your heat panel, they run like 10,000 volts through to make sure it doesn't combust. So that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, it's definitely a you get what you pay for situation. I think, you know, a lot of times, and I'm definitely guilty of this, but us as reptile people will spend a lot of money on an animal and then try to cut every corner possible with the setup. But with something like that heat panel, you're gonna get your money's worth over and over again for a very long time, especially if you're a longevity type of keeper. You know, if you're gonna have that animal for 30 years, that heat panel, that investment up front is gonna pay for itself in time.
I feel like that goes for any of the equipment we've discussed so far. Your
Yeah.
thermostats, there are people who have really expensive like retic collections, and you see they're using like the $30 Inkbird Amazon thermostats. I'm like, what are you doing? It's all power to them, I guess. But again, like you're saying, you invest in the right equipment because that'll translate to your animals and their long-term husbandry.
But
So
something that I thought of while you were explaining your, that strategy of having the probe on the cool side, that snake being able to access a hotter basking spot is not an issue considering you're cutting that at night and they're getting a night drop. If you have that snake able to get cooked like that constantly, okay, you might run into issues then. It's not a natural cycle for the animal to go through. I feel like some of the ball python doctrine is like have your hot spot at 95 and it's like that all the time. That might work for ball pythons, but that's not going to work for everything. So, that mindset will cause you issues and also if you consider like a V70 tub, your heat tape is just a little sliver on one end. Compare that to a cage where the heat panel takes up a quarter of the surface area of the top of the cage. Escaping that little 95-degree heat tape is much easier than escaping that much larger, stronger radiant heat panel. So while having a 95-degree spot at 4 a.m. is not the most natural thing in the world, doing that with heat tape in a V70 tub compared to a decent sized heat panel in a cage, it's a very different scenario.
It's important to remember too that heat tape and in a tub setup is that's elevating the surface temperature. Radiant heat panels, while they'll elevate the surface temperature, say on a basking shelf, the air is still being heated as well because that heat panel is radiating heat down into the cage. If you have a heat panel set to 95 and you have heat tape on a cage set to 95, the surface temperature of that basking shelf under the heat panel is going to be 95, but I guarantee you're going to notice an increase in the air temperature. Whereas if, say, you had the same size cage, but you had, say, 11-inch flex watt, that's like standard, flex watt heat pad size for a PVC cage.
Yeah.
You set that flex watt to 95, the cage floor might be 95, but I guarantee you your ambient air temperature is probably going to be around the same as the room the cage is in. That's just how belly heat works. It's really interesting when you think about it, and something that you got to consider depending on the type of heat source you're using. I'd imagine there's a whole different rule for incandescent bulbs in PVC cages like that, but I won't lie, whenever I'm running incandescent lights, I just run them at full power for my lizards because they just sit right smack under there and they cook themselves. It's a little bit different than, say, snakes, but definitely, again, the type of heat source you are choosing to use will determine, I guess, how you want to regulate having your desired basking spot or desired hot spot.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a good point. So I guess since we're already kind of on that cage topic, do you want to describe how you go about your probe placement in a PVC enclosure? I mean, is it just the method of having it on the other side of the enclosure? Is that really all you're doing?
That's what I'm doing, because again, I'm keeping corn snakes. But I will say,
anything with your work or anything that you're doing differently?
Yeah, I would say that's what I was about to highlight. Is so I know what I was saying earlier. In theory, you could set your cool side probe temperature to say 81 for a ball python, and then drop it at night. However, the technique that we use, because we've got a couple mainland retics, and they're in some really big cages. I want to say, like, in the display enclosures that we've got, they're like 8x8x8s with a bunch of diagonal logs so they can stretch out. It's pretty awesome. But as you can imagine, if I had that probe sitting on that shelf, that snake will probably crush the probe. She's 16 feet and she's about 110 pounds, if not more. So the idea is that we do this technique, and I can't take credit for this. I saw it on YouTube. A guy named Zach Nava. What he did is he took the top of a clothes hanger and cut it off, And what it is, he used like zip ties and he wound the probe so that way it sits probably about an inch underneath the heat panel.
Mm.
So this way the snake really isn't going to touch it because, the snake's just going to want to sit under the heat panel. So now what you're doing is, and again, this is kind of, I almost want to call this the non-heat tape style method for a radiant heat panel, which probably makes it sound more overly complicated than it actually is.
I know what you mean, but yes, that's a very
so what we're doing is we set the thermostat to say 96, because since that thermostat probe is an inch below the heat panel, to get the hot spot where the retic's sitting at below the heat panel, let's say 89, right? Standard Python temp. The heat panel is about 14 inches below that shelf, so maybe closer, I want to say like a foot or so from the back of the snake. If not, maybe closer to 10 inches. The idea is that by having the probe set to 96, that gets the area where the snake is at around 89 degrees.
Okay.
But that's just what works for us. As you can imagine, your room is going to play a big role in how high you have to set that, temperature to get the 89-degree hotspot.
Yeah.
So
sure.
the ambient temperature that snake enclosure is in the room, it's usually in the mid 70s. So that's why we set the probe to 96. If you're, let's say more realistically speaking, a pet person with a locality retic, like, Calico or a Madu or whatever, something that's going to stay smaller, you've got it in a nice big enclosure in your living room where it's 68 air conditioned, you might have to set your probe temperature using that method to 105 just to get the same 89-degree hotspot. Now, it doesn't mean the snake is getting 105 degrees. And as you just said, your rattlesnakes probably can get to 100 degrees. And I want to say I saw a video forever ago of somebody that had a big retic out in Florida, and he temp gunned its back where it was sitting partially in the sun, and it was like 105. So if your snake gets up and bumps the panel and the panel's running at 105, big deal. It's not, wedging its face into the panel. If the snake's doing that, you've got another problem on your hands. But for the most part, that's something that you have to consider with that method. But otherwise, that's really the only way we typically run our heat panels, because with those snakes, we try to have more of a constant hot spot. We're not really doing too many night drops on those.
Sure. Yeah, I've done a similar type of thing where I've done it in tubs for arboreals, like primarily green tree pythons, but instead of with a coat hanger, with a like a paper clip.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, same kind of thing to give it some tension so that it will sit up higher. I think I've seen some people attach their probes to their perches for their arboreals, but then I think you kind of are going to run into the same problem of that snake being entirely encapsulating that probe, where your reading isn't going to quite be exactly what you'd hope it would be. But I think in a situation like that, what you were saying about the cool side probe might actually work well if you want to attach it to a perch to regulate that panel. So because I know if I were to do that with the scrub pythons, where I would have try to suspend the probe up higher, they would knock that thing down in a heartbeat. So they unplug their panels frequently as well, so they definitely like to mess with stuff.
If you end up trying the cool side mode with the scrub pythons, like I said, I just literally have it dangling in the air, so that way if the snake hits it, it sort of swings back and forth. They can't, unless they diligently try to wrap around it, they're just gonna fall off of it. And so that way, again, the probe is truly measuring the air temperature, the ambient temperature, and then the panel just turns on randomly depending on the time of year, which means if you're gonna bask, you got to figure out when the heat's on, which they pick up on it because they're snakes. But it's cool seeing them. I guess seem somewhat. I don't want to say enriched. I mean, because I guess that's more like what the cage is. But they're just sort of doing what snakes do, I guess.
Yeah. Well, you give them the environment in which they can actually perform natural behaviors. Because if you give them that artificial kind of environment, they're not going to go through those same movement patterns throughout the day. So that's something that I never really appreciated it until I started keeping my rattlesnakes and started doing their temperature or like their limited basking period and whatnot. And, I saw daily activity out of the snakes, and you would see how they would have their movement patterns surrounding around the time where their panels were on, or their bulbs were on. And I just, I found it really fascinating. It was also like, if they do this, I bet all these snakes would do it. So,
like I said, I'm doing it with corn snakes, and
yeah,
it's just as rewarding. I know they're probably a snake that everybody has kept, but I love them, and I like that they're kind of easy.
Oh yeah, they're great. No, can't hate on a corn snake. If you do, get out.
Ball pythons, though, no.
Yeah, you can all day. Hit and hate on
sarcasm aside, so we've gone over like heat tape, and then your what's it called, the heat panels. Mm-hmm. So one other thing that when it comes to like thermostats, probe placement, and we sort of highlighted some of our techniques, I want to say, on our last episode, but incubators. So maybe, I know we talked sort of about what we try to keep our incubators at and some ideas, but instead of temperatures of incubators, like how do you set up your incubator? Are you doing a forced air incubator? Did you do a DIY incubator? And there's a lot of different incubators out there. Some are great, some are absolute garbage. I definitely do mine a little bit differently for the lizards, but as far as like, where do you put your probe? Why do you put your probe in that area of the incubator? Break that down.
Yeah. So I've used all sorts of different types of incubators. Right now I have 3 incubators, 2 that are the smallest model of the Sea Serpent's hot box incubator. So they obviously have the fan. And then I have a larger custom incubator that somebody else put together that was like a converted restaurant fridge into, it's a pretty decent sized incubator. And, it has a network of fans, and it's really far too complex for what it really needs to be. And actually, I think it isn't ideal because of that for a couple of reasons. But what I've always done with my incubators, the thing that to me is always the most important is having basins of water in the incubator to create the ambient humidity. I'm not a huge fan of the airtight egg box. It just seems entirely unnatural to me. Under what circumstances will that ever happen naturally? So not something that I like to do. I don't like having to be constantly wiping condensation off of my egg boxes as well. If you leave town for the weekend and you could run into problems with water droplets forming on your eggs. My probe placement, though, what I typically will do is, it depends on the incubator. So the smaller incubators, I just kind of like to have it hanging somewhere near the middle of the nest box, somewhere that kind of gets a good general reading of just what's going on in there. As close to the eggs as I can. I never put it in the egg box, but I also run the sensor push sensors in the main chamber and in the boxes themselves. So that's kind of, to me, I find no need to have that probe in the egg box when I actually have an accurate reading in the box. I'd rather just adjust the thermostat a little bit than, try to do all of that. Especially considering that I primarily use SIM containers. And, if you're going to have the probe running in the side, now you have this big gap because they're pretty rigid, or you're putting a hole in the side of it, and then you can't move the box because now you have a probe in there. So, there's so many complications that are just completely unnecessary if you try to have a probe in your egg box itself. With my bigger incubator, though, it has 2 different heating elements, bottom and top, and they're, I have them controlled separately on a herpstat, and there's just the corresponding probes are on the shelves that are closest to, kind of like middle, bottom, middle, top. And but then same thing, I have my temperature sensors that I really base it off of, and you know, I really don't base the temperature off of the probes. I set the incubator to where it needs to be to have those sensors reading properly. That's really about it. But so yeah, that's what I do. How about yourself, Sir Alex?
So like, I don't know. This is, I want to say 2 years. I have the medium size hot box incubator.
Mhm.
That's kind of all I have right now as far as a professional incubator. Otherwise, in the past, I've had some, not gonna lie, kind of garbage DIY ones that they worked, but I definitely, I wanted to save up and I guess sort of invest in something that would last me a while. So I guess pretty much what I'm doing now with the hot box is kind of identical to what you do, where I put the herpstat probes in the middle of the shelf. I don't have sensors in my egg boxes because with the lizards, I definitely do more of like a night drop on the incubator. So
Okay.
I don't mind if the temps fluctuate because, if say I have my herpstat, I set my daytime temp to 84 degrees, 84.2 if you want me to be specific, because for my data logging, that's 29 degrees Celsius. And then my night drop is set to 26 Celsius, which is 78.8. So assuming they're off by a degree, okay, so it's 85 during the day and it's 77 at night, or it's 79 and 83. I've literally hatched water dragons at all of those temperatures at a constant, so I'm not worried about the fluctuation. But down the line, I'd like to get some sensor pushes or Govee, to put those in my egg boxes. But the problem that I think I would have is, unless I'm doing the water dragon eggs and sims, I don't feel confident enough if I ever get Hydrosaurus eggs to try those in sims yet. I'd like to hatch them first. I bury my eggs, as I said earlier. So it's like, even if I put the, like, say, a sensor push thing in the egg box, the egg is, buried by 2 inches of vermiculite in soil. So how do I really know what the temperature that is?
Yeah, fair enough.
Or the exact humidity. I mean, it's probably going to be 100% because I have a tray of water in that incubator. But in the past, I've done styrofoam box with a heat pad and light diffuser grid, and it worked. The other incubator that I've done is, and I want to say telling you about this, but I had a old cooler, and then I had fish aquarium heaters. And so that's sort of like, instead of saying the hot box incubator that we just talked about, where the heat tape is providing heat and the tray of water is keeping the air at 100% humidity, the aquarium heater is heating the water to, say, 84. So now your water is also maintaining that heat. And since water, if anybody's here listening is a chemist, in chemistry, for pretty much from what I understand, every element and different, I guess, chemical combinations. In the case of water, right, 2 hydrogen atoms, 1 oxygen atom, they refer to the way that those chemicals, or I guess, chemical combinations change temperature and how fast it changes temperature. They refer to that as specific heat. So water has a really high specific heat, meaning it takes a lot of energy for it to change its temperature quickly, relatively speaking. This is why, we grew up in, Illinois. We're right by Lake Michigan. That's why in the summer, Lake Michigan is still freezing, because it has been pummeled by the winter. And then during the winter, Lake Michigan is technically warmer, and that's what causes the lake effect, because it's been hit with the sun all summer. So as you can imagine, in an incubator where you are using water to be your humidity and heat source, and you're already, you're doing it with, say, a Coleman cooler, something that's meant like an ice chest.
Yeah.
You're already, taking some, your base, which takes a lot of energy to change temperature and fluctuate, and you're putting it in a super insulative, incubator in a sense. So for species where you don't want a ton of fluctuation, in my opinion, that would be the go-to. That's something I'm planning on building again, just because for the sake of, not putting all my eggs in one basket, I'd like to have a second incubator on standby. But that would be that would just be another example of an incubator. And obviously with those aquarium heater based incubators, the thermostat is directly on the dial. So what you'd more than likely have to do is take like a digital thermometer with a probe, or you could do a herpstat if you want and like set your herpstat, say, to 86 and your aquarium heaters to 84. So if for whatever reason one of those malfunctioned and your water starts to rise in temp, the herpstat's going to turn those off.
Yeah.
But you know, the herpstat probe would then just tell you the exact temperature in there. As far as though, I guess like incubator setup, one of the problems that I had with the hot boxes originally is I was worried about the water in there. And now after, you know, having run it, I'm realizing my paranoia was just unwarranted. And so I actually had too much ventilation. And since the hot boxes have a fan that's constantly running, that excess air movement dried out my eggs in a sim container. I had really bad hatch rates last year because of that. Whereas literally by the time I caught that, I put a tray of water in there. My second clutch hatched all right, but I think it was because they, in the case of the water dragons, the first month of those eggs being in there with 4 vent holes in the sim and a, you know, sea serpents incubator that had no water to keep the entire air humidity in the incubator 100%. The air moving in and out of the sim with the eggs not being in contact with substrate, they were just too dry. So that would be, again, why, you know, like I said, I just, you know, like you were saying, keep the air humidity as high as possible. It just makes it easier. It makes it bulletproof. And I personally, too, have never had luck doing eggs in airtight containers. I've always actually had mold issues, usually before I have condensation issues, just from the stagnant air. Or as I said earlier in the case, where if I'm setting up the eggs the way I've been taught, and even then when I was hatching water dragon eggs, I've always buried them 3/4 the way in the substrate. I do like dirt and vermiculite. You know, I literally will just take some soil from my nest boxes because that's what the mother is laying her eggs in. And I always thought like the acidity of like the peat and sphagnum in the nest box might help reduce the, like in theory, wither away a little bit of the calcium to make hatching easier. I've heard people talk about that with Boyega because Boyega have really thick egg-shelled eggs. And some people say you got to feed Boyega birds so that way they're not getting excess calcium from the rodents they're eating. But then there are plenty of people that have bred Boyega on rodent diets, but they do put sphagnum moss on the eggs, and sphagnum is acidic. So it's like, are the Boyega laying in tree hollows or rotting tree hollows where the decomposition is more acidic? It's just
interesting.
Yeah, something that I had always thought about. So I figured, you know, if she's laying in the dirt, and again, you're going to have little springtails and stuff that if you get mold on good eggs, they're going to eat that. So
yeah,
whereas if I was using straight vermiculite, that's not happening. So just guess you could say it's a bioactive incubation setup. Whoa. But I mean, it works. Yeah, that'll piss a lot of people
I think you
off.
you should start talking down to people and telling them how stupid they are in comment sections for how they do their stuff.
Yeah, that'll be how you get views on YouTube now. Bioactive incubator. Everybody else is irrelevant. Anyway,
you're all abusers if you don't use bioactive incubation methods.
Oh yeah, how awful. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at with incubators. Like I said, the forced air incubators are just, they're nice, they're convenient. The one con that I have heard about when you build an incubator that's taller is you can get hot spots. So for example, if your probe's in the middle, that might be 84. The bottom or the top, say the top of the incubator, because heat rises, might be like 84.5 or possibly 85, depending on the size of the incubator. So that's just something to keep in mind. The other thing, and I guess this is where I'd say it's more or less like a win with the Coleman cooler style that I suggested, and that I've used in the past. And I want to say the main argument that I've heard for this, because I can't take credit for this, Garrett Hartle, this is how he has incubated some of his eggs, is that if you have a long incubator, your eggs are all at the same level. So you're sort of avoiding that hotspot dilemma in the newer incubators, because if your incubator is 4 feet long and your shelf is literally just one giant 4-foot shelf, no matter where your eggs are at, for the most part, heat's rising. So if they're in that middle layer, they're going to be exposed to the same air temperature.
Yeah, for sure.
So that was just another, insight that might be beneficial. But again, in my case, I really could care less if my incubator has hot spots or not, because I have a night drop. So
Yeah.
if it's at the top shelf and maybe it's 85 or for whatever reason peaking at 86 for a couple hours, it's going to drop back down to 79, 80.
Yeah.
And I was reading in one of Bert Langerworth's old article on Australian water dragons, how he actually did some experiments where he would dig up the clutches from his outdoor setups, and he would measure how deep they were buried, and then he'd just bury them and surround it with a wire cage on his property, and he'd put like a high-low thermometer. And so sometimes those eggs got 96 for like 2 hours, which you think would kill them, and then they drop down to like 71 at night. So it's just something that I thought was interesting. And the biggest thing that I'll be curious about is seeing what time of day the eggs hatch, if I get good eggs, and keep running them in the night drop. Because I've never done a night drop on the water dragons before. I've always done constant temps. So be curious, because Langerworth was noting that they all hatched in the morning, almost like there was some cue to the eggs, like you got to hatch out when the sun comes up, try and find your first meal. Because if you hatch at night and you're a diurnal lizard, you're just asking to get picked off by a nocturnal predator.
That's very interesting. Yeah, that would be cool to see. Huh. That would make sense, though. That would make sense.
And I want to say, like, even with some snakes, people have talked about that. I know I said on one of our previous episodes, you talked about how you used to like lower the temperature further into incubation. And I forget, I was listening to one of your episodes. Somebody was saying how like Jason Hood, or not, was learning from, what was his name? It might have been Gavin Brinks, about how like the blackhead eggs, dropping those like 87 and then 86 at night, like just a degree. And how he was like recording where the female was sitting at night. So it's just cool things that we can all learn anecdotally. But again, I know I'm straying off of the topic of the physical incubator, but the point is, it's
probably Brett Bender. I would assume, if it was Blackhead Talk. So shout out to Brett if you're listening.
But it was a great episode. I'm hoping the Womas at work go this year, and then a couple of years we'll give blackheads a shot. Our male's just not big enough yet. But yeah, like I said, it's just when it comes to incubation, definitely use what works for you. But as far as the overall setup, the biggest thing is just dialing in the water, the air, and the temperature. You get that dialed in, and you get it in an equilibrium.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to, you kind of showed us your superiority with your bioactive incubator. Well, you got one up in the comments. How about a bioactive house? Just swimming in springtails, isopods crawling on your walls. Who needs a bathroom when you have a bioactive house?
Yeah. I had a massive house centipede I caught the other day. Have you ever seen those? They've got like 100 legs.
I think like the kind of like fuzzy looking ones.
Oh no, they're way bigger.
Oh, shit.
I'll see if I can find a photo.
I've not done.
It was massive. I didn't even know they existed, and then I saw it and I could not believe it. So definitely rocking the bioactive here for anybody watching on video.
It's not shitting on the floor. It is feeding your bioactive home, and it is superior. Okay, that's a very dismissive way to describe the future of home cleaning systems. Okay. One day we'll all see. We reverted back to our original form. Okay. Yeah, I feel like I remember seeing those in Chicago.
Yeah, they're something, but they're cool. Apparently they eat a bunch of like the little silverfish and stuff, so who knows. Yeah. But yeah, good stuff. So we've gone over, let's see, thermostats, heat panels, heat tape, probe placement. So that's sort of like, I guess you say, the heating, the tools, right?
Yeah.
Hatching eggs, like that's more heat. This will probably apply more to you for your personal collection, but for me, it probably applies more with my work. Tools for handling. So you've got scrub pythons. I think you've done a great job of, starting to really push away the old school gatekeeping mentality of, I think I've heard you say heat-seeking missiles. They're evil. I've worked with your snakes, dude. Like, a lot of yours are great, especially your captive bred ones. But the reality is that even if you've got the tamest scrub python in the world, like a 14-foot beauty, if for whatever reason she had a bad day, you want to have the equipment to work with her correctly, safely, professionally, represent the animal and you as a keeper in a good light. So let's talk tongs, hooks. What are your, again, this is going to apply more to you, as I said, like break down, how do you safely work with, let's just start with scrub pythons, right?
Yeah.
Hook sizes, like what are you looking for hook wise? Some people say with certain like fast arboreal snakes, be it venomous or non-venomous, you want it to be longer so you have room to work with for the sporadic motion.
Yeah.
Like what goes into your hooks, your tools when working with them?
Yeah, obviously venomous and non-venomous is going to be an entirely different conversation. With a scrub python, it's pretty difficult to have a hook to where you would be entirely out of their strike range at any given point in time. Kind of the general rule of thumb with a snake hook is the longer the snake hook is, the less control you're going to have over the animal at the end of that hook. And for that reason, I might not always use a hook with a scrub python that is as large as you may expect. But it all kind of comes down to the amount of separation or closeness I'm trying to have with that animal, and then also the proximity in which I'm working with that animal. Like in my room with my adult cages, there's some areas to where if I had my 42-inch hook and I was trying to maneuver an animal back into its cage, I would be hitting the glass on the cage behind it, and it would be more difficult than it would be otherwise if I had a shorter hook. But with that said, this is a pretty good example right here. I don't know if I back up, this is a 40-inch get hooked hook, and no affiliation. If they want to sponsor me, that'd be sick. But get hooked are my favorite hooks I've ever used. The logo is no longer there, but that's all of my hooks are from them. I've used hooks of a ton of different brands. The only other one that I would say I put up there would be the AE Stony hooks. They're pretty great too. But like the Midwest Tongs hooks, to me, they're just too bulky.
I'm saying, see, that's what I've got are some Midwest stuff, but I primarily use those if I'm like field herping and I just want to flip stuff.
Well, but they're great for that. So, the hook choice is a balance between strength and then user friendliness, so to speak. Those Midwest hooks, those tools are primarily made for herping. If you're trying to lift a large log or a rock or something like that, this might not be the hook for that purpose. It's thinner, it's very strong to hold a snake, but I wouldn't want to bring my nice hook out into the field to be all scuffed up and whatnot. This hook I'll grab right now. This is my favorite hook I've ever had, and it serves so many purposes. So this is from Get Hooked as well. I think it's called like their travel series. It's like 26 inches or so. One thing I love about this hook, I don't know the terminology of all the different parts of the hook like some people do, but the point of the hook, whatever this is called, I hate the hooks where it's like this, where you have so much extra on the end. My favorite hooks are the ones where the height of the end of it and then the height of the shaft of the hook are essentially the same. Because like if you have a snake on that hook and you're trying to pull it towards you, and there's, let's say, a branch in the enclosure or a height or something, if your hook is longer than, if the end of the hook is longer than the shaft of the hook, this only makes sense for anyone who's watching the video right now. You could catch something on your hook over here that the shaft of the hook would not be catching on. So for that purpose, I really like this hook. It has a pretty wide mouth or whatever you want to call this. So you can fit a pretty decent sized snake in there, but again, whatever, this what you want to call this part of the hook.
Just the tip of the hook.
Yeah, I know all these. They all have names. I don't know any of the names. If that's disproportionately larger, you're just going to have a hard time maneuvering that hook head around. I know for this same reason, people like Terry Phillip swear by L hooks. I've used L hooks. I'm not quite as big of a fan of L hooks, but it's probably because that's not what I have used, not what I'm accustomed to, primarily with venomous, and for good reason. Where with an L hook, because if you're going to slide a hook under the snake, it's going to be sideways, and then you turn the hook to where it's vertical, and now you're maneuvering the snake. This hook has to go through you have to go through more of a motion pattern to achieve that grasp with a snake. Or with an L hook, you just need to do a 90-degree turn, and now you have control of the snake. So I think for that, I would say, and I don't use that for my venomous, that would be much more important with the lapids, with fast-moving snakes where fractions of a second make or break an interaction. With a lot of vipers, that it just isn't quite the case as much. Obviously, you want to use the same level of caution, but for me, especially primarily with rattlesnakes, they're not going to move towards you probably most of the time until you actually move them. The movement that they're going to do by the touch of the hook is going to be a bolt in the opposite direction. Not necessarily a bolt towards you. And as far as that goes, you're going to get that, if you would even get that, more once the snake is up on the hook. So yeah, I mean, L hooks are great as well. I just don't use them personally, just because I'm so used to the U-shaped hooks. And then the grip on this hook is different than most. Most hooks are essentially just golf clubs that are no longer golf clubs. I can either grasp the handle, normally, or I can have my hand in front of it, and then I have a bit of a backstop there, which just creates some more stability for me. Or if I want to, put it on my forearm, like something like that. It's very versatile, and I really like this hook. Anyway, so I don't necessarily have a rule of thumb of like length of hook compared to length of snake. Like I said, probably a lot of the time, if these snakes wanted to jump out past the hook at me, they probably could. With some of my big adult scrubs, the hook that I would use for them, they wouldn't quite be able to get all the way to me in most instances. You also need to understand the snake's positioning when you're first interacting with it. If it's coiled up, if it's in a hide or something like that, limitations on their physical movement will greatly determine how close a snake can get to you. If a snake is fully coiled, poised, looking at you, ready to strike, and you try to reach past its head to grab the first coil with your hook, bringing that snake effectively like 2+ feet closer to you, and you get nailed, that's entirely your fault. But in that instance of snake is looking at me, you go right to the head, you go under the head, try to push it away, get it to move the opposite direction to where you can grab the first third of the hook, run it back to you where you grab kind of right at the end of the second third, beginning of the final third. And then you kind of have those two balance points of back third, front third of the snake. And then typically, most snakes at that point, that's a position where they feel comfortable, especially anything that's semi-arboreal or arboreal. Where having two pressure points is something that they're accustomed to. If you were to do that with a bull snake or an indigo or even like a Sanzinia, that's not a snake that is going to have that as a natural position that they would ever really find themselves in. So wouldn't work for that. But for something like, for almost any python, that would work. Most boas, that would be a good strategy. Most vipers, that would be a fine strategy. You might not necessarily want to have your hand that close up on a viper. You might have the tail of the viper or a secondary hook at that point in the body.
The point is that 2 points of contact.
Yeah, exactly. That balance, typically with the front third elevated over the back third, to where if you have that balance going the other direction, to where the back third is the higher point, the snake wants to turn around to correct its balance. Most snakes feel more comfortable when they're going up as opposed to when they're going down, of a semi-arboreal to arboreal nature. That's an issue that I see frequently with people handling scrub pythons, is that they have that balance wrong. They have their backhand is up and their hook is down, and now their snake is coming back at them, and they think that the snake is being aggressive or whatever. It's just uncomfortable with the balance that you have assigned to that snake. If you were to take your hands from here and switch them, now the snake is going to go up. You're going to see slower tongue flicks. The animal is going to be far more calm now that their body is in a position where they actually feel comfortable. So I think all this might be topic for an actual video with a snake, kind of showing all of these types of behaviors.
Good points nonetheless, though. And I'm sure there's plenty of people who are listening now or will listen to this and be like, oh, that makes sense. They're probably doing it on instinct because that's what their mentors may have taught them with the snakes that they're working with. But a little refresher.
And then as far as the hook itself goes, the U of the hook being kind of flatter, a longer curve, that's going to nestle the snake in there much more comfortably. There's some hooks that are very much like V-like, even though they're slightly rounded. That snake is going to have pressure on the side of its body. It's going to, this is not a, if you were to grab a snake like that, it's not going to be comfortable. If you have a snake that's sitting on your hand without pressure on the side, you have a calm snake. You put the pressure on the side, and even if you don't have contact on the bottom, that's a tense snake that's immediately going to have a defensive reaction. So a good wide base of that hook to where the snake is going to sit in there comfortably. And then I don't like the hooks that fall off here as much, kind of right where the U starts, where it's, I'm not
the drastic drop.
Yeah, like this is probably, what would you call that? Like a 65-degree angle downward, as opposed to a 90-degree angle downward. I just find it to be a much more comfortable position for both myself and the snakes. It kind of flows a little bit better. But then also if it isn't deep enough there, once you start to have your hook angling downward, let's say you're holding a non-venomous snake up, you never want to hold a venomous snake up this way. There's going to be a point to where that hook, this portion of the hook, the first kind of, for the audio listeners, where the hook starts to curve downward, is going to go past flat, and now that snake is going to slide back onto you. And in the case of a non-venomous snake, might not be the end of the world, might result in a bite. In the case of a venomous snake, could result in death. So, I always say with a venomous snake, you never want to have that hook angling to where the head of the hook is above your wrist, because that just promotes that snake to slide down to you. Conversely, if you have the hook angled lower than your hand, now it promotes, especially if it's an arboreal, to climb right up to you. So to have that hook as flat as possible is always the goal. So if that snake does come to you, typically in a case like this, you'd have a secondary hook where you go right under that snake, you pull it back, you start the process right back over. But at that even plane, typically that snake is not going to have as much of an urgency of the sideways motion is going to be much more casual than either an upward motion or downward motion. So it's all kind of about learning balance points on snakes, how it makes them react, and then getting comfortable with putting yourself into those positions with the snakes too, which frankly, once you get it down, and this as well, the position that's comfortable for the snake ultimately is comfortable for you as well. And the ones that are uncomfortable for the snakes are uncomfortable for you as the handler too. So it does work out well that way.
Your point on having the hook too high up, that was definitely a mistake that I've made in the past, where working with some semi-arboreal stuff, like I had a friend who was training me with some retics, and I've had it even just unfortunately with, like, at work, we've got some tubs that are higher up, And so I try to carefully get the retake up, and I've had it where if I've angled it too far, that snake did slide back. And thankfully, no bites were taken because I just reacted really quickly. But it's something where, I just, got to tell myself not to do that. Like I'll fully admit, like I've made mistakes, and,
Sure.
like you're saying, it's a non-venomous snake. Thank goodness. I don't work with any hots other than we've got a couple display rattlesnakes, which are never touched because they're big naturalistic setups. But the point is, if that was a cobra, game over. It's that real, that quick. And thankfully, like I said, in the case of that python, it was just move maneuver away, hook it off the ground, and then carefully keep it, angled so that way the snake can feel like it's balanced. And again, I don't know how to describe it, but it's like they just seem to chill, or like you said, they slow down when they're where they want to be on a hook.
Yeah.
And if you're too high, you're too low, they just start to flail. Sometimes you get a snake where if they're on the ground, they start flailing. And as soon as you pick them up, you sort of got to have that mix of confidence and technique. And then once you find that, middle ground there, they just ride along real nice and easy.
It's actually kind of an interesting experiment, or whatever you would want to call it. For any of us, you and me, we both work with some colubrids that have that stress response of going all whippy like that.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're handling that animal with the hook and it's freaking out, and if you get it to the right point where you have the first third body positioning to where it's not going to back up and it's not too far ahead where it's going to continue running, you can literally get to a spot where that snake just kind of pauses. And it's like, oh shoot, this is actually where I'm comfortable. It's kind of cool to see, like, it's literally like you press a button on that snake and it's like the chill out button.
Mm-hmm.
Where they just, their body feels comfortable because they can really do whatever motion they need to from that position, which is almost kind of counterintuitive. You're putting them in this really advantageous physical spot, but it actually calms them down.
Mm-hmm.
Where they could go wherever they want from that position, but now they're cool and they want you. Like my spilotes, for instance, like, spilotes are interesting snakes behaviorally because they're probably, I would say, the most visually oriented snakes in the entire world. And they're confident as well. So visually oriented plus confident can oftentimes result in a snake that, will probably bite you in its enclosure. They stand their ground. They're not really runners. Like some other colubrids can be. I mean, they will eventually, but they'll take them a lot longer to get to that point of running. But then every last one of them outside of the enclosure is super chill. So that to me is just an example of a snake that needs to find that position of comfort. Once they have their tail all wrapped around you, that anchor to where, they're, say, given that they're prehensile tailed, if the entire front 90% of their body spontaneously fell from wherever it was, they're fully confident knowing that back 10% of their body will completely support their weight and their head will be back up to that point before you can even blink. And that's where they've established that level of comfort. When their tail does not have that grip and they're kind of floating there, that's when they're uncomfortable and you might get one to turn around and bite you because now they feel very vulnerable in that position because they don't have that physical balance that they are shooting for. So I guess it doesn't fully answer the whole hook topic, but I guess the synopsis would be, a hook that's long enough to give you some good separation, especially from like kind of consider the first third of the snake. Not a hook that is so long to where you lose control over the animal that you're handling. A hook that is a head that is large enough to hold the body mass of the snake, not so large that the snake can kind of be swimming back and forth in that hook. And then, a hook that's sturdy enough to where it's not going to bend or whatever once that animal's on it. Also not so heavy that now you're more worried about managing the weight of the hook than actually than the snake that's on the other end of it. So, there are a number of different factors involved But something that we've both done, and I know we've had this conversation, is for newer keepers, use that hook for whatever you can. Become extremely familiar with doing things with that hook in your hand. Do you want to expand on how you've kind of done that for yourself?
Yeah, I when I was trying to, I guess, train myself to just sort of make it second nature, is best way I can compare it to, like, almost like sword fighting. It's not just a tool; it's an extension of your hand.
Yeah, for sure.
Like that. So like sometimes even at work, like if I'm cleaning stuff and I'm going from, like, say, the indigos, which I don't hook out, but I use a hook to keep my distance because they usually come flying out thinking I'm feeding them, or like with any of the hydrodynasties, some of the pythons and whatnot as well. The idea is, I'm opening tubs with that hook. I'm pulling the cart with the hook, like just trying to practice looping it around the handles, or like just working with it, trying not to use my hands, learning to not just train myself how to use the hook, but make hook use almost instinctual. I won't lie, and I'm not trying to sound like a coward. I hate being bitten by stuff. I don't like being bitten. And the reality is, too, just given my situation at work, I'm the only person overseeing the breeding operation right now. So if, heaven forbid, I don't want to find out if I'm allergic to false water cobra venom, right? Yeah. So I get it. I've seen people handle their hydrodynasties, no problem. All power to you. I will always use a hook with them. Yeah. That's just my personal preference. Even when it's opening the tub and, we've got some holdbacks that are starting to realize, I bring them chicks and mice and they fly out mouth open. I hate to think what would happen if my instincts were to just be open in that tub with my hand. Say I was just thawing food and then I open my tub, they fly out, bam, they latch on. And when, those snakes bite, they bite and they instantly start chewing. They're so fast. So really, I said, just make a hook a part of your routine. Even with my corn snakes, I don't hook them out, but I tap train them. I just make it a habit. Open the door with the hook, tap them so they know they're not getting fed, and then I can reach in and pull them out. Yeah. It's little things like that I just feel not only sort of builds me a little bit of confidence with using my equipment, but at the same time, just safety, right? Like how long does it take before, if you consider, say, I'll bring up the retics, right? Malaya python, that genus, they've got the slashing teeth on the front, which that's why they're in their own genus to my knowledge, and a couple other morphological traits. Cool. Yeah. It's like the first don't quote me on this, but I want to say it's like the first 4 or 6 teeth. When a retic, people say they do a slash bite. It's like the front of those teeth it's recurved, but it's not recurved as if, say, you were to get bit by a Burmese python or a ball python, where, you just get punctured and then it hooks in. The retics, they will cut and then sink in. So even it's nasty. It's horrible to think what would happen, if a 6-foot locality retic were to even grab your hand, right? That little bit of extra damage. Or, like you were showing, 32-inch hook. Open your tub or your tank, tap train that snake, carefully hook it out. Once it's out and I realize it's not getting fed, retics are super smart. A lot of snakes are super smart. They calm down right away. So that's just, again, sort of where I try to incorporate using hooks. I can't really comment on my personal collection because, again, I'm mostly doing lizards, which I'm fairly hands-off with. But with what I do professionally, it's just making it a part of my everyday routine. And honestly, the more you do it, the more you get better at it. Yeah, I'll admit it. I've made plenty of mistakes with it. Like I said, I've picked up snakes and they've slid down the hook, and so you'll learn where to work your angles. And like what you were saying with Get Hooked, I'm sure if you were to go onto their website, find a model, or maybe invest. We were talking about investing in good thermostats. Invest in some good equipment. Find which ones you like. Don't, people are spending thousands of dollars on snakes. Don't, if you're spending, I don't know, let's say $2,000 on that locality retic, like I was just saying, you can probably drop $200 on some nice stainless steel hooks, right? And so
probably wouldn't spend that much.
Oh, well, yeah. So, I don't really know the price of snake hooks because I don't really personally buy too many of them. But it's just something that, again, if you're, you're not only investing in yourself by practicing those techniques, but you're just investing in sort of the safety of your animal and kind of just, refining your techniques as a herpetoculturist, if you will, which
Sure.
I think it's cool. And, it's something that when people, especially outsiders, are looking in, who do they want to see? The guy like, yeah, I love getting bit by a snake. Like, they don't want to see you covered in blood. They want, hey, look, here's the tools that I'm learning to work with my animals responsibly. It provides a good outside viewpoint of what we do and what we're doing working with these animals. And I said, all part of that that professional presentation to those who don't keep reptiles or amphibians. On the topic, though, I guess, of professions, and I feel like maybe this will be a good way to wrap this up, seeing as we're approaching on 2 hours. Aside from the tools, I kind of want to take a step back but expand. So we talked about, thermostats, heating. All of that uses electricity, and electricity is just a big part of what we need to keep our animals. Running electricity safely and in the sheer quantities that we as private keepers do, like to keep our rooms heated. In my case, I'm running fluorescent lights. I'm running incandescents. I want to sort of talk about, I want to hear your opinions, your insights, because I know when you were in Chicago, I remember you were showing me your room, how you even had your electrical sockets redone, sort of expanding. And again, I'd like to preface by saying I'm not an electrician by any means. So anything that I'm about to discuss regarding safety of electric, I'm merely talking about from my own experience and using different products to avoid. I know it sounds kind of scary to talk about it, but how many times have you heard somebody who had a fire happen in their collection, right? What was usually the cause? It's an electrical issue because they were running an extension cord and an extension cord. And sometimes, it's a faulty heat lamp or heat tape burning, but heat tape, have a good thermostat on it. We just covered that. And in order to have a good thermostat, find a safe way to plug that thermostat into an electrical outlet, be it a surge protector. So I guess, like I said, I was hinting at it earlier with, the way you redid your room initially. Do you want to sort of break down, how do you safely run your cages, your thermostats? Are you using surge protectors? Do you have a custom circuit breaker? Sort of expand on that.
Yeah. So, I think there's a few basic principles. I think the main principle, or the main thing to never do that reptile keepers will make the mistake of, is having a space heater on an extension cord. Don't do it. Plug your space heater directly into the wall. I bet there's a strong enough gauge extension cord out there that can support some space heaters, but I won't ever do it. I'm not an electrician either. I have rudimentary knowledge just based on being around some projects regarding, setting up electrical for reptile rooms. That'd be the primary thing. Do not do not plug in your space heaters to an extension cord. Plug it into the wall. If you have the privilege of designing a reptile room from scratch, have more outlets along your electrical circuit. Having 8 outlets on a circuit, having 2 outlets on a circuit, it's still the same size circuit. You're still going to have the same amount of power that can be drawn from that line, but you just eliminate the need for all these additional extension cords and whatnot, opportunities for risk. If I'm using power strips or anything like that, they're always surge protectors, just kind of doing the little things that I can. With the outlets, I particularly, if I can, have a room that I'm starting from scratch, I like to have a little bit higher off the ground, especially if there's around cages, so that you could, access them a bit easier. In the instance of a flood, they're higher off the ground, to not even to where the socket itself would be experiencing water, but anything that's kind of hanging down. If you have an extension cord or a power strip that is plugged into the wall, like a 9-foot power strip, if that power strip is hitting the ground, you could be, you know, potentially exposing that to water, and you know, water and electric don't work well together, particularly. And do you have any? I don't want to talk entirely about this. Do you have anything you want to add so far?
So in my case, the water actually sort of applies because with all the lizards, they're getting hosed down.
Yeah.
So with the way that I have my setups, unfortunately, just given the room I have, I've got your sort of standard, you know, there's 6 outlets around my reptile room. And so I bought, I want to say they're expensive, but I won't lie. I do not want to risk anything. They're like the $40, you know, 12 outlet, you know, each outlet is spaced almost 5 inches apart, but then it's got a 9-foot heavy duty cord surge protectors, like the professional grade ones.
Yeah.
And so the reason I got them, so that way the cord's 9 feet, is so I can run those outlets literally along the tops of my enclosures. So that way all my heat lamps and stuff that I'm mounting inside, you know, say the standard dome light, I just buy my domes, you know, the 250-watt reflector domes at like a home improvement store. They come with a 6 or 10-foot cord. And so then I can work with that cord instead of like trying to have it go out the back of the cage and down on the ground. Literally just goes out, it's slack, and it just plugs straight into the surge protector. In this way, since, you know, I've got 1 surge protector pretty much per outlet, and I've got 2 to 3 cages along that section of the wall, the surge protector is on top of the cages. So now if the cages are back to back or side to side, I'm not having to stretch those cords. I'm not risking plugging in, say, a heat lamp into a timer or something that's in the surge protector. And you know what I'm talking about here, where the cord, if it's stretched, where the little bit of that metal sticking out, even though it's just getting that electrical connection, heaven forbid you get dust or something in there.
Yeah.
And, you know, dry filament, you know, from air particulates or whatever settling, electricity's running through there. Bam, there's your spark, fire. Bad. Like it's terrifying to think about. So having everything just well connected. But as I was saying, with the lizards being sprayed down, the reality is my outlets are not as high up as I'd like. So by also having these 9-foot cords, what I do is I keep them overall slack. But when I plug them into the wall, what I do is I create what's called a drip loop. So for people who are listening that keep fish, this is second nature for anything. What it's doing is the outlet is, say, plugged into the wall, and I let the cord slack down just a bit before it then shoots up. So this way, if, say, I'm hosing down a cage, right, and some water sprays out the back vent, or like the lizard jumps into the water, say the sailfins, they love doing this. They sit at their high perch and then they jump 5-6 feet down into the water.
Yeah.
Water splashes out, and heaven for, again, you know, it's that one water molecule works, you know, the perfect, you know, bullseye through a vent.
Like in the SpongeBob movie.
Exactly. It hits that power cord and it starts to roll down. If I had perfect tension on that surge protector, that water is going to roll down the power cord out the back into the outlet. But by having that slight loop at the bottom, almost kind of like what you were saying with the snake hook, right? That slight U before it plugs in, the water droplet just goes down to the bottom of the U and then it falls onto the ground.
Yeah.
And so that's just one small preventative measure to prevent that water interacting with that electrical outlet, especially in my case, because everything I keep needs high humidity. It's getting sprayed and hosed down daily because those lizards, that's how they drink. And again, I'm also using big tubs of water. Like I was saying, for people who keep fish tanks, that's second nature because they're working with a lot more water than most of us reptile keepers are, and amphibian people for that matter. Yeah. So the other thing that I do, like I said, is I have to admit it's expensive, but I'm liking the herp stats running my incandescent lighting. It's less of a power surge on my circuit. I don't know if it's saving me electricity, but I'd like to think by having the bulbs running at literally 1% capacity and slowly ramping up to 100%, technically my heat lights are only on now at full capacity for 11 hours a day instead of 12. And because of that, one, you're saving electricity. 2, my bulbs are lasting longer. But 3, I'd just like to think the energy draw is not as drastic. You know, nothing really scares me more than having every single, like, say, you know, all the stuff I keep right now is on a 12-hour, 12 off cycle. 12 on, 12 off, I should clarify. So if I had every light in the room kick on at 8 a.m., no ramping, boom, right? All that electricity is just being drawn at once.
Yeah.
That terrifies me. So I won't lie. The other technique I've done is I have literally my enclosures organized as like water dragon group A, water dragon group B, sailfin group A, yada, yada, yada. And water dragon group A might turn on from 6:30 a.m. till 6:30 at night, and group B turns on at 7 a.m. So I never have every cage setup turn on at the exact same time.
Okay.
You know, it might not be as pretty and synchronous as, you know, some people want it to be, where they want to see their whole room turn on at the same time.
Yeah.
But the reality is I'd like to think it's reducing the overall sudden energy burst on my electrical circuit. You know, so that's just another way to reduce the electrical pull at a time. Like I said, I'm really trying to just avoid any major surge. Again, the surge protectors are there in the event something happens to the overall power grid here. But if I can avoid having a massive surge of electricity by just turning all the lights on and off with my timers plugged into those surge protectors, again, it's just a preventative measure, and I'd like to be extra safe.
Yeah.
And then lastly, what I wanted to talk on is, and you'll probably laugh at this, I try to avoid daisy chaining T5 fixtures. So, and the reason why is because technically speaking, that is like running an extension cord. Is it nice? Because in theory, you could avoid running all of your T5, or you could have all your T5 fixtures running on one outlet. Absolutely. Trust me, it would be wonderful. But the reality is that the amount of amps that would draw from that single outlet, I've got like 25 T5 fixtures. Okay. I have a lot, because I have heat and visible light and all that good stuff, you know, that the lizards need, because they're really dependent on bright levels of light. But yeah, that would just be terrifying if I did that. So I only try to use the daisy chains within certain setups, just because, like, say sailfin group D has got UV daisy chain, so that way the UV turns on a certain time, and then half an hour after the UV, my visible lights turn on. That's it. If I had all of that on at one, that'd be 200 something watts of electricity that's just firing off all at once, and it's working its way through each fixture. Just that, now that I'm saying it out loud like that, kind of just scares me to think about it. Like, more room for error, right?
Sure.
So yes, is it annoying because then you're using more outlets per fixture? Absolutely. But from a safety standpoint, you know, I'd rather, you know, go to sleep at night and feel more comfortable at work, knowing that there's a less likely chance that I'm going to have an electrical issue, because I wanted everything to look nice and tidy. It's sort of one of those areas where you do have to prioritize functionality over aesthetics. That being said, with, like, say, some of the herb stats, you know, you can run fluorescent lighting on them. And so maybe, say I'll just say for like one of my customers, you're a Chinese water dragon keeper that wants to do a natural setup, sort of similar to what I do for my groups, right? You use Herbstat 4, you know, you've got your heat panel with a night drop to keep your overall ambient temp, and maybe output 3 and 4, you know, output 3 is your halogen light, output 4 is your UV, and have them turn on half an hour from each other, just to avoid a surge between the two fuses. You know, don't have them turn on at the same time. Have one ramp up, have one turn on, have one turn off, and have one ramp down. Just keeping the electricity separate, I guess, is the best way, just so that way it's more diverted, diluted. Like I said, I'm not an electrician. Maybe that doesn't mean anything at all, but I'd like to think by avoiding having everything just all on, all off, I'm reducing that overall electric pull for each of my enclosures.
Cannot imagine it would hurt. Definitely cannot imagine it would hurt. Yeah. Not something that I do, but maybe I should. So, maybe. But another thing that we talked about that I wanted to add in the electrical conversation is the topic of setting up mini splits or window air conditioners. Oftentimes that these units need dedicated lines because they have such a large pull, you know, to where typically for a large like a mini split unit, you need a 220 line for for that unit. So you got to be, and this is from electricians that have helped me with these projects in the past. You want to be careful about running a line that is too big for the unit that you're anticipating using, because the kind of the delicate balance is, you want to be able to run all of your electrical on the line that you need to use without tripping the breaker, because then obviously everything turns off if you overload the line. But you don't want to leave too much open space at the top end of that line, because then if some unit on your line of electricity malfunctions and starts pulling excess energy, then it would take significantly a longer period of time or more energy pull to trip that breaker. For instance, if you have a standard 110 line and you have 95 watts running on that line, then if one of the fixtures or whatever starts malfunctioning, there's only a certain amount of space remaining on that line before that breaker is going to trip. If that was all on a 220 line, that's when a fire could potentially start, because now you're potentially pulling an extra 100+ watts of power from that line to a fixture that's malfunctioning. Same thing can happen with like a mini split. So if you have a 220 line that you had dedicated for your mini split or whatever, you end up using a smaller unit or a smaller window air conditioner that has a capacity, or is going to run at half capacity for that line. If something malfunctions with that unit, you have a much, that unit's going to malfunction for a long time and with a lot of power before that line trips it out. So when you're setting up your room with either a window unit or a mini split, make sure your electrician knows, or your HVAC tech or whoever's doing it knows what the unit in fact is, so that they can install the proper line for that unit to where it's going to run properly. It's not going to trip it running in typical fashion, but that also there isn't excess, there isn't excess power potential on that line. And I just realized I've been saying watts instead of volts this whole time, so I sound like a total idiot.
Okay. I think people got the gist of it.
But anyway, volts. Okay, I sound dumb anyway. It's late at night. I've been up since very early. Fuck you. No, I'm kidding. But anyway, so the point being, especially with our reptile rooms, we're running fixtures that are not typical household appliances. You want to make sure that you're running those lines at like 90% capacity, to where if an issue does arise, the breaker is going to trip pretty soon thereafter. So that would be my last thought on that. And I'm gonna have to go back and post and edit out every time I said watts and say volts instead. So, yay! All right. Do you have anything else to add on to the electrical topic, Sir Alex?
It's pretty much all I've got. As I said, I'm not an electrician, but speaking from experience, I have tripped breakers in the past. The biggest thing that I guess I could last minute add is that, from what I understand, extension cords do draw more amps. So I really try to just have all of my room organized now where it's the surge protector is the only thing coming off of the wall. And like I said, that's why I try to get surge protectors with a lot of space, so I can have like a 4-prong timer to run all the heat lamps of cages, say C through E. And then off of that, and there's another surge protector coming off of, say, wall outlet 2, and just trying to sort of, again, divert that power as much as possible without running as many cords, especially extension cords. That was just something that the electrician, when I was going to school, we were redoing, I should say, one of our herpetology labs. so we could have all of our aquatic animals there, which need a lot of filtration. They're pulling a lot of electricity. And so they redid all of the outlets. And that's something he had mentioned. He's like, try to avoid using extension cords. Just plug them directly into the wall, ideally. And if you can't do that, high-end surge protectors.
Cool.
So that's really what I do, is a surge protectors, so I can have 12 outlets, and then try to avoid anything else.
Cool. All right. Well, if you have nothing else to add on that topic, I think we might be time to wrap this baby up. We're 2 hours and 10 minutes about.
Nice.
Pretty
This is a good talk, man. I don't know, definitely, especially regarding some of the heat stuff that we talked about at the start. I think I'm gonna have to reassess some of the rack setups at work, and maybe I might try a couple different methods we talked about and just see how stuff runs.
Sure.
That's what's nice about the herb stats, is you get your high and low history, and some of our racks are using the spider web, so it even tells you, like, they have a graph on there now which shows you when stuff is experiencing the high and low. So might give it a shot and experiment and compare the difference, as opposed to just all doing the same thing. You know, I want to learn, I want to try new things, and might be cool. And I hope everybody that, you know, tuned in live, or people who are re-listening to this, you know, hopefully you guys learned something new. And if not, or if you've got other advice, feel free to comment on this video. I want to say all of the live streams are left up on the Trap Talk Reptile Network YouTube channel, so you can share your experiences and start a discussion in the comments of this video, because experience from everybody is only going to help everybody understand each aspects of the topics we've discussed, and that'll help make it so people can really dial in their tools of the trade, as was this episode.
Absolutely. Well said. Well, I think we might have to revisit a round 2 of this kind of topic on some other tools and systems and whatnot in the future, because, you know, we touched on some good stuff today, but there is still plenty more to talk about for sure.
I could dive into UV. I've had some great mentors with, and again, with the lizards, that's definitely something that I have to focus on, but yeah.
Cool. All right, man. Well, let everybody know where they can find you online and everything, and how they can keep tabs on what you got going on.
Yeah. If you guys want to follow me along for my lizard work on Fauna Classifieds, Facebook and Instagram, just look up Alex's Agamids, exactly as it's spelled. You know, agamid, those are the lizards that I work with. And then if you want to contact me, pretty much I will have my email on all of those pages. I don't really respond to my personal Facebook page messages. I just, you know, that's more for my family and, you know, personal life stuff. But if you've got lizard inquiries, feel free to reach out to me there. Or if you have product questions, I'll happily answer those. And yeah, thanks. Appreciate it, Steve.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I really appreciate that you took the time tonight, and it was one hell of a conversation.
Thanks, man.
Hell yeah. So I will close out the show, but yeah, again, thank you, man, and have a good night.
You as well.
All right. All right, everybody. Thank you for tuning in tonight. If you are in on the live chat, thank you very much. It is very much appreciated. If you are listening or watching after the fact, thank you as well. Means a lot that people take their time out of their day to listen to what we have to say and be here for the conversation. So it's why I do it. Absolutely love it. For us all here at the Trap Talk Reptile Network, please subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, Buzzsprout, wherever you get your podcasts from. A 5-star rating on any of the audio platforms would be greatly appreciated. There's a new episode of lists of different podcasts every single night of the week here on the Trap Talk Reptile Network by the absolute best hosts in the game, covering some of the best topics from a wide range of different disciplines within reptiles. For me personally, you can find me on Instagram at Scrub Shepherd, or just Stephen Kush on Facebook. I pretty readily respond to messages on both platforms, so if you hit me up, I will do my very best to get back to you. And yeah, that is it. That's the episode, guys. Thank you again to everybody who tuned in. And with all of that said, we'll see you back here next Wednesday for a new show.